What would you do if the world took everything from you, leaving you with nothing but a single silver dollar and the clothes on your back? What if that dollar, a coin heavy with insult and dismissal, was the only price you could pay for a new life? For one young woman, cast out and alone at 18, she bought a $1 abandoned mine cabin, a place the world had already stripped of value and left for dead. But the truth waiting inside, walled up in the cold dark of a forgotten shaft, would change not only her life, but the soul of an entire town. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Ilara Vance and the secret of the Althea lode. The dust of the trail had settled into the very weave of her dress, a uniform of grief and grit. Ilara Vance rode into the town of Dust Devil Gulch, not with hope, but with the dull weight of necessity. She was 18 years old, though the look in her eyes belonged to someone much older, someone who had already seen one life end. Her horse, a gray gelding named Shale with a swayed back and a patient soul, was the last living link to the world that had vanished just a week before. The memory was a raw splinter in her mind. Her mother's shallow breathing in the small cabin they'd shared, the scent of pine and illness, and then the terrible silence. The day after the funeral, her stepfather, Silas, a man whose heart was as hard and barren as the land he worked, had pressed a single cold dollar into her palm. "This settles it," he'd said, his voice flat. "Your mother's gone. This place is mine now. Be gone by morning." He hadn't looked at her. He had looked past her, at the horizon, as if she were already a ghost. That dollar wasn't payment. It was a final, clean severance. It was meant to say, "You are worth nothing more than this." And so she had taken Shale, the horse her mother had loved, packed a small satchel with bread, a blanket, and her mother's worn wooden spoon, and ridden away without looking back. Now, the town of Dust Devil Gulch rose before her, a handful of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness. It was a place of last chances, and she was down to her last dollar. She tied Shale to the hitching post outside the county land office, the leather of the reins smooth and familiar in her trembling hand. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and chewing tobacco. A portly clerk with a stained vest looked up from his ledger, his eyes skimming over her patched dress and worn-out boots with casual disdain. "Help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. "I'm looking for land," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear. "Something to buy." The clerk let out a short, humorless laugh. "Land costs money, girl. A lot more than it looks like you've got." Ilara didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the single heavy coin. It was still cold. She walked to the counter and placed the silver dollar on the scarred wood. It made a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. "I have this," she stated. It wasn't a question. The clerk stared at the coin, then back at her face. The weary determination in her gray eyes seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, he seemed to consider just telling her to leave, but then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man about to enjoy a private joke at someone else's expense. $1, he mused, tapping a thick finger next to the coin. "Well now, I do believe we have just the parcel for you." He turned and shuffled to a dusty shelf, pulling down a thin, forgotten-looking file. He blew a cloud of dust from the cover and opened it with a flourish. "The old Althea lode," he announced. "Played-out silver claim up in Whisperwind Canyon. Got a miner's shack on it. All yours. For $1. The way he said it, the offer was an insult in itself, a final confirmation of what Silas's gesture had begun. But Alara Vance looked at the deed, her name waiting to be written on the line, and saw not an insult, but a foothold. The clerk's smile widened as he explained the terms of this dubious transaction. The Althea load, he said, wasn't so much a property as a problem the county wanted off its books. The silver vein had run dry 60 years ago, the original claimant long dead and gone. The cabin, he assured her with a wink, was mostly still standing, provided you didn't lean on it too hard. The mine shaft itself was collapsed and boarded over, a tomb of rock and failed dreams. The land's no good for grazing, no good for farming, the clerk droned on. Just rock, thistle, and wind. We keep it on the ledger for $1 for tax purposes. You're the first person foolish enough to ask about it in 20 years. Just then, the door to the land office swung open, letting in a rectangle of blinding sunlight and a large, loud man who seemed to fill the entire room. He wore a fine leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat that bespoke prosperity. This was Jedediah Thorne, a rancher whose holdings spread across the valley floor, a man whose voice was accustomed to being obeyed. He glanced at Alara, then at the deed on the counter, and let out a booming laugh that made the dusty windows rattle. "Don't tell me you found a buyer for the old ghost trap, Henry!" Thorne bellowed at the clerk. He looked Alara up and down, his eyes filled with a dismissive, pitying amusement. "Buying the Althea load, are you, girl? Planning on mining moonbeams and misery? That's all that's left up there." Alara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. She would not be shamed. She had been dismissed by one man already. She would not let another's scorn break her. She dipped the offered pen into the inkwell, her hand steady, and signed her name, Alara Vance, on the deed. The scratch of the nib on the dry paper was the sound of her planting a flag in a barren land. She pushed the silver dollar across the counter. The dollar her stepfather had used to cast her out was now the dollar she was using to claim a place of her own. It was a bitter trade, but it was hers. The clerk, Henry, stamped the document with a heavy thud and slid it toward her. "She's all yours," he said, barely suppressing a snicker. "The wind, the rocks, and the ghosts." Thorne was still chuckling to himself as Alara folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She gave a single curt nod and turned to leave, her back straight, her dignity a thin but resilient shield against their mockery. The single dollar was gone. In its place was a piece of paper that promised her a pile of rotting wood and worthless stone. It was, by any sane measure, a fool's bargain. What secret could a pile of rocks and rotting wood possibly hold? Was this young woman's dollar and her last hope truly wasted on a forgotten canyon? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. But as Alara rode out of town, deed in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin, against all logic, was waiting for her for a reason. The town of Dust Devil Gulch watched her go. As Alara led Shale to the general store to spend the last of her pocket change, she could feel their eyes on her. The story of her purchase had already made its way from the land office to the saloon, carried on whispers and puffs of laughter. She was the dollar girl, the latest bit of frontier folly for the town to chew on. At the store, she bought a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, a handful of nails, and a single candle. The storekeeper counted out her coins with a pitying slowness, as if each one were a tear. He didn't meet her eyes. She was already a ghost to them, a walking cautionary tale. As she stepped back out onto the dusty street, securing her meager provisions to Shale's saddle, an old woman sitting on a weathered bench caught her eye. She was ancient, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a stillness that seemed at odds with the town's restless gossip. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't whispering. She was simply watching Alara with a strange, unnerving focus. As Alara passed, the old woman spoke, her voice as dry and soft as rustling leaves. "Some roots," she said, not to Alara but to the air between them, "grow best in stone." Alara paused, the cryptic words hanging in the air. She didn't know what they meant, but she felt their weight. It was not a warning, not quite a blessing, but something else entirely. She nodded to the old woman, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and the woman gave a slow, deliberate blink in return. Her brief, strange encounter was shattered by Jedediah Thorne's booming voice from across the street. He stood with a group of men outside the saloon, a cigarillo clamped in his teeth. "There she is, the Baroness of Broken Timbers," he called out, and his companions roared with laughter. "Enjoy the company of the wind and the ghosts up there, girl. That's all that claim has ever paid out." Alara's jaw tightened. She focused on adjusting a strap on Shale's saddle, her movements precise and deliberate. She would not give him the satisfaction of her anger or her tears. She had learned from her stepfather that silence was a language powerful men did not understand and could not defeat. She finished her task, swung herself up onto Shale's back, and turned him toward the steep, winding trail that led out of town and up into the high country. As the last buildings of Dust Devil Gulch fell away behind her, the laughter faded, replaced by the rising whistle of the wind. The trail to Whisperwind Canyon was little more than a goat path, winding up through jagged rock and stunted, wind-twisted pines. The sky was darkening, the clouds gathering in bruised shades of purple and gray. A storm was coming, both in the sky and in her heart. She thought of her mother, who had always found beauty in the harshest landscapes. She would have seen the grace in the gnarled pines, the strength in the unyielding granite. Then, a kinder memory surfaced. Ben, the old farrier from their previous town, a man with hands as tough as leather but a gentle touch with horses. He had been her mother's friend, and he had taught Alara how to read a horse's mood by the flick of an ear, how to calm it with a soft word. Shale, her silent companion on this lonely journey, was a testament to that teaching. The steady, rhythmic plod of his hooves on the rocky ground was a comfort, a connection to a time when she had not been so utterly alone. The trail grew steeper, and the first drops of cold rain began to fall. She pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and urged Shale onward into the heart of the canyon that everyone had told her was worthless. The journey into Whisperwind Canyon was a battle against the land itself. The trail all but disappeared in places, forcing Alara to dismount and lead Shale over treacherous scree slopes and through thickets of thorny brush. The wind, true to the canyon's name, howled through the rock formations, a mournful, constant song that seemed to pull the warmth from her bones. Shale was magnificent. The old horse, dismissed by many as past his prime, moved with a steady, certain grace, placing each hoof with an instinctual wisdom that shamed Alara's own tentative steps. He was her anchor in this wild, unwelcoming place. They arrived at the claim just as dusk was bleeding the last of the color from the sky. The cabin stood in a small, rock-strewn clearing, silhouetted against the bruised clouds. It was exactly as the clerk had described, and somehow worse. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. One of the two windows was a gaping hole, the other boarded over with mismatched planks. The door hung from a single rusted hinge, swaying slightly in the wind. Next to it, the entrance to the Althea lode was a dark, forbidding maw, covered with heavy, graying timbers nailed shut with a grim finality. The entire place radiated a profound and ancient loneliness. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over Ilara. This was her inheritance, a pile of ruin. Thorn and the townspeople, their mocking laughter echoed in the wind. They had been right. She slid from Shale's back, her legs trembling with exhaustion and disappointment. For a long, heart-stopping moment, she considered turning back, riding down into the darkness and just keeping going. Going where she didn't know. Anywhere but here. Then Shale nudged her hand with his soft nose, his warm breath a puff of comfort against her cold skin. He looked at her with his dark, knowing eyes, as if to say, "We are here now." Ilara reached into her pocket, and her fingers found the folded deed. The paper was stiff, real. This place, this broken, forgotten place, was hers. It was the only thing in the entire world that was. "All right, boy," she whispered, her voice rough. "We'll stay." She knew better than to risk sleeping inside the derelict cabin. The roof looked ready to collapse under the weight of a strong gust. Instead, she found a relatively sheltered spot against a rock wall a few yards away. She unsaddled Shale and rubbed him down as best she could, then used what little energy she had left to gather scrub brush for a small fire. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny orange beacon against the encroaching dark. She ate a piece of dry bread, sharing a small portion with her horse, and huddled in her blanket, watching the cabin. In the flickering firelight, the empty window looked like a vacant eye, watching her. The place didn't feel threatening, just sad, as if it had been waiting a very long time. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted into a troubled sleep, the sound of the wind her only lullaby. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she was jolted awake. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The wind had momentarily ceased its howling, and in the sudden ringing silence, she heard it. A sound. It was faint, rhythmic, and seemed to come from deep within the earth. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of a rock settling or a branch falling. It was measured, deliberate. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening. The sound seemed to emanate from the direction of the boarded-up mine shaft. After a few seconds, it stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Was she losing her mind? Or was she not as alone in Whisperwind Canyon as she had believed? In the clear, cold light of morning, the tapping sound felt like a figment of a weary imagination. Ilara told herself it was a woodpecker, or the strange acoustics of the canyon, or simply a dream. She had more immediate concerns. Survival. Her first priority was water. She left Shale to graze on the sparse patches of grass and began a systematic search of her small plot of land. For hours, she found nothing but rock and dust. Despair began to creep back in, a familiar chill. But then, tucked away in a small ravine behind the cabin, she saw it. A patch of damp earth, a cluster of green, stubborn ferns. She dug with her hands, frantically at first, then with more care, until she uncovered a small, choked spring. The water that bubbled up was slow and muddy, but it was clear and cold. It was life. This small victory felt monumental, a sign that the land was not entirely against her. With water secured, she turned her attention to the cabin. If she was to survive the coming winter, she needed shelter. She pushed open the groaning, half-hinged door and stepped inside. The interior was a scene of utter decay. Decades of dust lay thick on every surface, stirred into dancing motes by the light slanting through the broken roof. The floor was littered with debris and the droppings of small animals. A stone fireplace, choked with rubble, stood against one wall. It was a daunting task, but work was something Alara understood. She began to clean, using a pine branch as a makeshift broom. As she swept away the layers of filth in the far corner, her broom snagged on a raised edge. She knelt down for a closer look and saw something that didn't fit. The floorboards in this small section were different from the rest. The surrounding planks were wide, rough-hewn pine, dark with age and secured with square-headed, hand-forged nails. But these 3 boards were narrower, made of a lighter-colored, smoother wood, aspen perhaps, and fastened with smaller, round-headed nails of a kind she hadn't seen before. They looked newer, placed with a different purpose. Later that afternoon, her curiosity drew her to the boarded-up mine entrance. The timbers were immense, weathered to a silver gray and hard as iron. Heavy, rusted spikes held them in place, driven deep into the frame. It looked impenetrable. But as her eyes traveled down the barrier, she noticed something on the lowest board, just above the ground. Carvings. They weren't letters or numbers. They were symbols, deliberately etched into the wood. A delicate spiral, a 5-pointed star, and a perfect crescent moon. They weren't the idle whittling of a bored miner. They felt like a code, a secret language. A name floated up from her memory. The name on the deed, the old Althea Lode. It was a woman's name. Prospectors and miners were men. Gruff, hard men like Silas or Thorne. Who was Althea? The name felt as out of place here as the aspen floorboards and the cryptic symbols. The tapping in the night, the newer planks, the strange carvings. They were 3 disparate facts that refused to make sense on their own. But together, they felt like the beginning of a question. Alara didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of profound, unsettling curiosity. This place had a story, and she was standing on the first page. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of pure, unadulterated labor. Alara Vance was no stranger to work, but this was different. This wasn't for Silas or for anyone else. It was for her. Every nail she hammered, every stone she lifted, was an act of claiming her own life. She started with the roof, using fallen timber from the surrounding woods and a bucket of mud mixed with dry grass. She painstakingly patched the holes, her hands quickly becoming a geography of calluses and cuts. She found the broken hinge for the door, and with Shale's patient help as a brace, she managed to rehang it. The solid thud of the door closing for the first time echoed in the canyon, a sound of permanence. Her silent companion, Shale, was ever present. He would stand for hours in the thin sunlight, watching her work, his ears occasionally flicking at the sound of her hammer. His quiet presence was a constant source of strength. He was a living reminder that not everything beautiful was loud, not everything valuable shone. He was steady and loyal, and that was enough. Her biggest challenge was the fireplace. It had partially collapsed, the chimney blocked with a mess of stones and old birds' nests. It took her 2 full days to clear it, her face and clothes black with soot. As she was carefully resetting the stones around the hearth, one of them came loose in her hand. It was heavier than the others, and felt oddly shaped. Behind it, where it had sat for who knows how long, was a small, dark hollow. Her heart quickened. Treasure? She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something small, dry, and delicate. She pulled it out. It was a flower, perfectly preserved, its petals turned to stone. It was a pale, star-shaped bloom, of a kind she had never seen growing in the harsh canyon soil. It felt like a secret. She wrapped it carefully in a small piece of cloth and tucked it away in her satchel. The mystery of the different floorboards in the corner continued to bother her. Every time she swept the floor, her eyes would linger on them. The work had taught her patience. She didn't rush. But one afternoon, with the cabin mostly secured against the elements, she decided it was time. She took the claw end of her hammer and, with great care, began to work at the edge of the first aspen plank. The nails resisted, groaning in protest, but finally gave way. She lifted the board. The air that rose from the darkness below was not the musty, stagnant air of a forgotten cellar. It was cool and clean, with a strange, earthy smell, and underneath that, something else. A faint, sweet, floral scent, like crushed herbs or night-blooming flowers. It was the same scent that clung faintly to the petrified flower she had found in the fireplace. In that instant, two things clicked together in her mind: the scent and the rhythmic tapping she had heard that first night. It hadn't come from the main mine shaft outside. It had come from directly beneath her feet. With a growing sense of urgency and wonder, she pried up the second board. Below her, illuminated by a sliver of sunlight, was not a dirt floor, but the top rungs of a sturdy wooden ladder, descending into absolute blackness. The darkness beneath the floorboards was a palpable presence. It seemed to breathe a cool, ancient air up into the cabin. Alara knew she had to go down. She couldn't leave the question unanswered. She fashioned a torch from a dry pine branch, smearing it with pitch she'd scraped from the trees. With the flame casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls, she took a deep breath and swung her legs over the edge. The ladder was solid, its rungs worn smooth by use. She descended, one rung at a time, into the heart of the mountain. The ladder ended in a small, hand-dug chamber. It was not a root cellar or a simple storage pit. The walls were surprisingly smooth, the floor level. The air was still and cold, silent as a tomb. Her torchlight flickered across the confined space. 3 of the walls were packed earth and rock, but the fourth wall, the one facing the interior of the mountain, was different. It was a carefully constructed wall of fitted stones, mortared with clay. She ran her hand over its surface. It was a false wall. She realized with a jolt that this chamber was a sealed-off portion of the Althea lode. Someone had deliberately walled this section away from the main mine, creating a hidden entrance right under the cabin. Her eyes scanned the chamber again, and this time she saw it. A small alcove carved into the rock next to the false wall. And inside the alcove sat a metal tin box. It was rusted and dented, but the lid seemed to be sealed shut with hardened wax. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it back up the ladder, her mind racing. Back in the relative brightness of the cabin, she used the tip of her knife to carefully break the wax seal and pry open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a leather-bound journal, a small, tightly tied pouch, and a roll of brittle, yellowed papers. She unrolled the papers first. They were exquisite, detailed sketches of plants, rock formations, and crystals, drawn with a scientific precision and an artist's hand. She opened the small pouch. It was filled with tiny, dark seeds of a dozen different varieties. Finally, she opened the journal. The first page read, in elegant, faded script, "The property of Althea Rosamond, geologist and botanist. Year of our Lord, 1827. Althea wasn't a miner's wife. She was the miner. Or rather, she was a scientist. As Ilara read, Althea's story unfolded, a secret kept by the mountain for over 60 years. She had come to the canyon not for silver or gold, but to study its unique geology. She had discovered that the water from the hidden spring, filtered through veins of a specific crystalline mineral, possessed unique properties. And deep within the caves, protected from the sun, this water nourished an incredible hidden ecosystem. She was cultivating a subterranean garden of rare, phosphorescent mosses and lichens that glowed with a soft, ethereal light. The sketches were her catalog. The mine wasn't played out. Its true wealth had never been understood. Althea had sealed the main entrance and built the secret one to protect her discovery from prospectors who would have torn the mountain apart for a few ounces of precious metal. The symbols on the outer boards were her own private markers for the seasons of her garden. And then, Ilara read a passage that made her blood run cold with wonder. Althea described how, in the deepest chamber, water from a single stalactite dripped onto a large, resonant crystal formation, creating a faint, rhythmic tapping sound that echoed through the rock. The mountain's heartbeat, she called it. Ilara sat back, the journal open in her lap, the dusty cabin around her seeming to fade away. She had not inherited a worthless, collapsed mine. She was the new keeper of a secret sanctuary, a hidden world of quiet, living light. The dollar she had spent was not for a piece of dead land, but for the key to a miracle. The mountain tested her resolve almost immediately. A week after her discovery, the weather turned. An early winter storm, born in the high peaks, descended on the canyon with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a predator, and snow began to fall, thick and fast, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. Ilara and Shale were trapped. The trail back to Dust Devil Gulch would be impassable, a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try it. She had to trust the shelter she had built, the cabin she had painstakingly mended. For 2 days, the blizzard raged. She kept the fire in her newly rebuilt hearth roaring, the warmth a fragile defense against the howling cold. Shale was safe in a small lean-to she had constructed against the cabin's most sheltered wall. During the long hours of isolation, she sat by the fire, reading Althea's journal by the light of her single candle. The words of the long-dead botanist were a comfort, a conversation across the decades. Ilara felt a profound kinship with this woman, who had also found solace and purpose in this lonely place. On the second night, as the storm reached its peak, a new sound cut through the wind's howl, a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat. Who could possibly be out in this? She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a weapon and cautiously pulled the door open a crack. A man stood on her threshold, his face caked with snow, his eyes wide with panic. Behind him, a woman was slumped over, half-conscious, with a small child bundled in her arms. "Please," the man begged, his voice hoarse. "Our wagon. Broken axle on the lower trail. My wife. The baby's coming." Without a second's hesitation, Ilara threw the door wide. She helped the man, Samuel, carry his wife inside and settle her near the fire. The woman, Mary, was shivering violently, her face pale. Their little boy, no more than 4, stared at Ilara with huge, frightened eyes. They had been trying to reach the next territory before the deep winter set in, and had been caught by the storm's sudden violence. Now, Mary was in the throes of early labor, brought on by the cold and the stress. Ilara worked quickly, her fear replaced by a focused calm. She heated water, tore strips from her spare blanket for swaddling, and did her best to comfort the terrified couple. Hours passed. Her candle burned down to a stub, and her lantern oil was running dangerously low. The cabin was descending into a frightening darkness, the only light coming from the flickering embers in the hearth. Then, an idea sparked, born of Althea's pages. It was a risk, but she had to try. Excusing herself for a moment, she grabbed a glass jar, lit a splinter of wood for a tiny torch, and disappeared down the ladder into the hidden chamber. She moved quickly to the place Althea had described as the Grotto of First Light. There, clinging to the damp rock walls, was the moss. It pulsed with a soft, blue-green luminescence, a cool, living light. Carefully, she scraped a thick patch of it into the jar, sealed the lid, and hurried back up. When she entered the cabin, the family gasped. The jar of moss filled the small room with a gentle, otherworldly glow. It was a calm, serene light, like captured starlight. In that strange, beautiful, and holy light, a short time later, Mary's child, a healthy baby girl, was born. The storm still raged outside, but inside the $1 cabin, a new life had begun, welcomed into the world by the secret light of the mountain. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. Inside the cabin, the small family was safe and warm. Samuel, the father, could not stop staring at the jar of glowing moss, which still emitted its soft, steady light. "What is this place?" he asked Alara, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. Alara simply smiled, a gesture that felt new on her face. As soon as the lower trail was passable, Samuel made his way down to Dust Devil Gulch. He returned not with scorn or pity for the town's dollar girl, but with a story that defied belief. He told everyone who would listen about the blizzard, the broken wagon, and the young woman in the abandoned mine cabin who had saved them. He spoke of her quiet competence, her generosity with what little she had. And he spoke with a stammering wonder of the birth of his daughter by the light of living stars, a strange, glowing moss she had gathered from within the mountain itself. The story spread through the town like a brush fire. It was too fantastic, too specific to be a simple lie. The town's mockery, which had been so loud and confident, faltered, replaced by a murmur of curiosity and disbelief. The kind professional of the town, a thoughtful, educated man named Dr. Abram, was intrigued. He was a physician, but also an amateur botanist. The idea of a bioluminescent moss in those mountains seemed impossible, yet Samuel's sincerity was undeniable. He saddled his horse and made the difficult ride up to Whisperwind Canyon to check on the mother and her newborn. He found Alara outside, calmly brushing down shale. The cabin behind her no longer looked derelict. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the newly mended door was painted with a wash of berry juice, giving it a soft, welcoming color. Dr. Abram examined Mary and the baby, declaring them both perfectly healthy. Afterward, Alara, with a shy reluctance, showed him a small sample of the moss. The doctor took one look, pulling a magnifying glass from his bag. He was speechless. He recognized it from drawings in obscure academic journals. It was Luminaria petrea, a species thought to be extinct for a century, prized not for any monetary value, but for its unique biological properties. Some ancient texts even claimed it had calming, healing qualities. He looked at Alara, his expression one of profound respect. "You are a custodian, Miss Vance," he said quietly, "not a prospector. This is a significant discovery." Jedediah Thorne heard the stories, of course. Full of bluster and suspicion, he rode up to the cabin himself, determined to expose the hoax. He found Alara chopping wood, the quiet rhythm of her axe a steady heartbeat in the canyon. Samuel's family was there, packing their mended wagon, their faces alight with gratitude as they thanked her. Thorne saw the cabin, no longer a ruin but a home. He saw the healthy baby wrapped in a warm blanket. And as dusk began to fall, he saw a soft, blue-green light begin to emanate from the cabin window. He froze. There was nothing to say. There was no argument to be made. He had declared this place dead, and this young woman had filled it with life and light. Without a single word, Jedediah Thorne turned his expensive horse around and rode away, humbled not by a confrontation, but by the quiet, irrefutable truth of what she had built. Soon after, others from the town began to arrive, not as gawkers, but as pilgrims bearing gifts, a sack of potatoes, a bolt of wool, a set of iron pots. They no longer saw the foolish girl who had wasted $1. They saw the woman who had found a miracle. Spring came to Whisperwind Canyon, and with it, an explosion of life. The slopes, once thought barren, were carpeted with wildflowers Ilara had never noticed before. The seeds from Althea's pouch, planted in a small garden she'd tilled by hand, had sprouted into strange and wonderful plants. Ilara was no longer alone. Samuel's family, grateful beyond words, had built their own small homestead in the lower part of the canyon, close enough to help. The story of the Angel of the Canyon had transformed her from an outcast into a quiet pillar of a new, burgeoning community. She did not become rich, not in the way Jedediah Thorne or the men of Dust Devil Gulch understood the word. The glowing moss was not for sale. It was the sacred heart of the sanctuary, a secret to be protected, not exploited. Following the careful instructions in Althea's journal and with guidance from Dr. Abram, who now visited regularly to document the unique flora, Ilara established a small apothecary. She learned the properties of the canyon's plants, creating remedies, salves, and teas that she traded for supplies. Her cabin became a place of healing. People would come up from the town, not just for her remedies, but for the profound peace that seemed to settle over the canyon. She would, on occasion, guide small, respectful groups into the upper, safer chambers of the old mine to see the earth stars, asking only for quiet reverence in return. One evening, at golden hour, Dr. Abram stood with her at the cabin's entrance. The setting sun bathed the canyon in a warm, honeyed light, and inside the cabin, the moss in its jar was beginning to answer the twilight with its own soft, blue-green glow. "The whole town still calls it the old Althea lode," the doctor said, puffing on his pipe. "It doesn't seem fitting anymore. Have you thought of giving it a new name?" Ilara looked out at her world. She saw the sturdy cabin she had rebuilt with her own hands. She saw her small, thriving garden, a patch of impossible green against the rock. She saw the mine entrance, no longer a symbol of failure and death, but a doorway to wonder and life. She thought of the seeds, the newborn baby, the community that was slowly putting down roots in this once-forgotten place. A slow smile touched her lips. "It's not a mine," she said, her voice quiet but certain, carrying the entire moral of her journey in its simple truth. "It's a nursery." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a reminder that true value is often hidden, waiting not for a pickaxe, but for a patient hand. If you were moved by Ilara's journey, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll be back next week with the story of a lone blacksmith who inherited a rusted, broken anvil, only to discover the songs hammered into its steel could change a town's future.